She had torn apart boardrooms the way other people tore apart napkins casually, methodically, without a second thought about the pieces left on the floor. Victoria Hart was 36 years old. And in those 36 years, she had learned exactly one inviolable truth about the world. Everything had a price, and the only question worth asking was whether you were willing to pay it. She had built Hart Dynamics from a mid-sized tech consultancy into a $2.3 billion empire, not by being the smartest person in the room, but by being the most decisive. Where other executives deliberated, Victoria acted. Where other CEOs softened their language, she sharpened hers. Her father, William Hart, had taught her that the difference between a good business and a great one was the willingness to move faster than doubt. She had taken that lesson and weaponized it, and now there were 37 companies folded into the Hart Dynamics portfolio that had once believed themselves untouchable. She was not cruel. She was simply certain, and in the world she occupied, certainty was the most expensive commodity of all. The Horizon Project had come across her desk the way genuinely important things always did, not through a formal pitch or an investment summit, but through a whispered conversation at a conference in Austin, where a venture capitalist she barely knew had grabbed her elbow and said, with an urgency that suggested he genuinely meant it, "You need to look at what Carter is building." She had looked. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, she had felt something other than calculation. Horizon was a distributed infrastructure platform, designed to decentralize the way cities manage their essential services. Water, power, communications, emergency response, turning fragile, centralized systems into resilient networks that could self-repair and redistribute load in real time. It was not merely a product, it was a philosophy encoded into architecture. The industry analysts who had reviewed it used words like paradigm shift and generational technology, and Victoria Hart, who distrusted superlatives on principle, had read those reviews 3 times and agreed with every one of them. Ethan Carter was 38 years old, and he was the kind of man who made boardrooms uncomfortable not through arrogance, but through stillness. He did not perform confidence. He simply possessed it in a quiet, load-bearing way, like a structural column that you only noticed when you tried to imagine the building without it. He had dark eyes that registered everything and gave back very little, and a habit of pausing before he answered that lesser people sometimes mistook for hesitation. He was not hesitating. He was deciding. He had been deciding his whole life about what mattered, about what he owed the people he loved, about the difference between ambition and purpose. He was also, in the way that mattered most to him, a father. His daughter, Lily, was 9 years old and had her mother's laugh and his stubbornness and an absolute genius for knowing when he was pretending to be fine. Her mother had left when Lily was 3, not with bitterness but with honesty, saying that she had married a dream and discovered she needed a life. Ethan had not argued. He had simply gotten up the next morning and made Lily breakfast and kept going. He had founded Horizon in the basement of his father's old house, using salvaged equipment and a whiteboard covered in equations that Richard Carter had first sketched out in the 1980s, when the concept of networked resilience was considered academic abstraction rather than urgent necessity. Richard had been an engineer of extraordinary intuition, a man who could see the shape of problems that hadn't fully materialized yet, who understood that the most catastrophic failures in complex systems were almost always preceded by small, ignored warnings. He had spent decades developing the theoretical foundations of what would become Horizon, and Ethan had grown up watching him, absorbing not just the technical knowledge, but the conviction that drove it. When Richard died of a heart attack 4 years ago, he had left Ethan 2 things: a house full of notebooks, and a request so simple and so weighted that Ethan had never been able to set it down. "Don't let anyone turn it into a tool for getting rich," his father had said, in the hospital, with the flat certainty of a man who has finished arguing with the world. "That's not what it's for." Victoria had made her first offer 14 months before the meeting that would change everything. It had been reasonable $8 million for a 51% stake, which was generous given that Horizon had not yet completed its first municipal pilot. Ethan had declined politely and without explanation. She had come back at $15 million, then $22, then 35, at which point she had stopped being polite and started being persistent, because $35 million was not a number that reasonable people declined without a very good reason, and she had begun to suspect that Ethan Carter's reasons were not the kind she knew how to negotiate against. She had restructured the offer 4 different times, bringing in advisors to reshape the terms, softening the acquisition language, building in provisions for Ethan to remain as lead engineer. None of it worked. He thanked her each time with the same quiet courtesy and said no. The meeting she finally demanded, not requested, took place on a Tuesday morning in March. On the 41st floor of the Heart Dynamics Tower in downtown Chicago, she brought 7 executives. She had the room set to project authority, with the contract already printed and bound and centered on the table like a verdict. $50 million. Clean acquisition, full transition of intellectual property, an advisory role for Ethan, at a salary that most people would consider a satisfying career by itself. She watched him read it. She watched his face do nothing in particular. And then she watched him pick it up, fold it once down the center, with the careful deliberateness of someone who has made a decision they are entirely at peace with, and tear it in half. The sound was very clean in the silent room. He set both halves on the table, and looked at her directly, and what she saw in his eyes was not defiance, and not performance. It was something quieter and more final than either of those things. Because what you want to buy, he said, doesn't belong to me. Victoria Hart had not been speechless since she was 24 years old and standing at her father's bedside. She was speechless now. The story broke within 24 hours, because these things always did. A billionaire CEO, $50 million. A torn contract. It was exactly the kind of story that the business press consumed like oxygen, and by Wednesday morning, Ethan Carter was trending in every financial publication from the Wall Street Journal to Bloomberg. The commentary was predictably split. Half the analysts called him a visionary, who understood that some things transcended valuation. The other half called him a fool who had let ego cost him a generational windfall. A particularly pointed piece in a Chicago Business Weekly suggested that single fathers with no institutional backing had no business turning down liquidity events, which was the kind of sentence that revealed more about its author than its subject. Ethan read none of it. He took Lily to school, drove back to the office, and went to work. Victoria read all of it, and found that it made her angrier than she expected, not at the coverage, but at herself. Because she had been in business long enough to recognize when she had miscalculated, and what she had miscalculated here was not the price. She had understood the product perfectly. What she had failed to understand was the person. That was a rarer mistake for her. And it sat poorly. She had built her entire competitive advantage on reading people accurately, on knowing before a negotiation began what the other party actually wanted underneath what they said they wanted. She had read Ethan Carter as an idealist who needed the right framing, and she had been wrong in a way that now felt not just professionally frustrating but personally interesting. She wanted to understand what she had missed. She called him directly, which she almost never did at this stage of a failed negotiation, and asked if she could come to his office. Not the boardroom. Not a restaurant. His office. He agreed without making anything of it, which she found itself unusual, and the following Thursday she took a car across the city to an address that turned out to be a converted industrial building in a neighborhood that had not yet decided whether it was being gentrified or simply weathered. The lobby smelled like strong coffee and machine oil. The elevator was the old cage-style kind that made a meaningful noise when it moved. His office was on the 3rd floor, and it was not what she had expected. She had expected disorder, the creative chaos of an engineer who lived inside his work. Instead, the space was organized in a way that suggested someone who understood that clarity was a form of respect for the people you invited into it. There were whiteboards covered in precise notation. There were stacked files with handwritten labels. There was a photograph on the wall, large and simply framed, of a man in his 50s with silver hair and reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, standing in front of a whiteboard covered in the same style of notation that filled the room around them. The man was smiling in the way people smile when they don't know they're being photographed openly, with their whole face, at something genuinely delightful. "My father," Ethan said, not because it wasn't obvious, but because it needed to be said. He made coffee without asking if she wanted any, which she found she didn't mind. And then he told her about Richard Carter, in the straightforward way that people with real stories tell them, without ornament, without the performed emotion that signals a story being deployed for effect. Richard had been a systems engineer who had spent 20 years at municipal infrastructure firms before concluding that the fundamental design of those systems was wrong at the root, not broken in ways that better management could fix, but wrong in the way that a building is wrong when its foundation assumes the ground will never move. He had begun developing his alternative framework on his own time, in evenings and on weekends, the way people work when they're not doing it for money but because they cannot not do it. Ethan had grown up watching that process, had helped with it toward the end, in ways that started as a son helping his father and became, over years, a genuine intellectual partnership. He knew he wasn't going to see it finished, Ethan said. He'd known that for a while. The last thing he said to me about it was not about the technology. It was about the intention. He said that what made Horizon worth building was that it was designed to serve people who couldn't advocate for themselves in the way that corporations could. Communities that got cut off when things went wrong, neighborhoods that always lost power first and got it back last. He paused and set his coffee down. He said if we ever let someone buy it and turn it into a revenue maximization tool, we'd be breaking the thing that made it worth anything. Victoria sat with that for a moment. She had known, in an abstract sense, that Ethan's refusals were principled rather than strategic. What she had not known was how deep the principle went, or what it was rooted in. She looked at the photograph of Richard Carter on the wall and felt something shift in the room between them. Not warmth, exactly, but an adjustment in the quality of the distance. She was not a person who cried easily or often, but she was a person who recognized when she was in the presence of something real. And this was real, in a way that made her careful. "I understand," she said, and meant it. She went home that night and sat in her apartment on the 43rd floor of a building that looked out over a lake that was perfectly beautiful and completely unrelated to anything she was feeling, and she thought about her father. William Hart had died 6 years ago, of pancreatic cancer that moved with the swift and total indifference of a natural disaster, and in the 2 years before his death he had said things to her that she had received at the time as wisdom, and had since, in the busyness of building the company he had left her, not quite gotten around to understanding. She thought about what he had said about Richard Carter. The thing was, she could not remember him saying anything about a Richard Carter. She could remember the names of every major business partner her father had ever mentioned. Every significant rival, every person he had described with affection or frustration or respect. She did not know the name Richard Carter. And that, she found, was the thing she could not let go of. Not because it was a business fact she had missed, but because the photograph in Ethan's office had shown a man her father would have been drawn to. She could feel it in the same instinctive way she had always been able to feel when two people should know each other. The quality of conviction was the same. She began, carefully and privately, to look. The company's historical archive was housed in a climate-controlled storage floor in the building's sub-basement. One of those infrastructural facts that everyone knew existed, and almost no one ever visited. Victoria went there herself, without her assistant. On a Saturday morning when the building was quiet, the archivist, a methodical man named Gerald, who had been with Hart Dynamics for longer than Victoria had been its CEO, did not ask why she was there. He simply let her in and showed her the organizational system and left her alone with 20 years of the company's paper history, which was arranged in gray metal shelving units that stretched the length of the room in the particular silence of things that have not been disturbed in a long time. She found the first reference to Richard Carter in a folder of patent co-filings from the late 1990s. It was not flagged or highlighted in any way. It was simply there, in the institutional record, the way true things often are, before someone decides they should be obscured. William Hart and Richard Carter had filed 2 joint patents, one in 1997 for a distributed monitoring architecture, and one in 1999 for a load balancing protocol in networked utility systems. The language was dense and technical, but she could read enough of it to understand that she was looking at the early bones of what had eventually become Horizon. Both men's names were on the filings. Both men had contributed. She sat on the floor between the shelving units with a folder in her lap, and a specific coldness running through her that she had learned, over the years, to treat as information rather than feeling. This coldness meant that something important had been hidden. She did not yet know whether it had been hidden by her father or from him. And the distinction mattered enormously. She kept going. She found a partnership agreement from 2002, a handwritten draft that had never been formally executed, outlining a joint venture between William Hart's firm and a smaller engineering consultancy that bore Richard Carter's name. The draft was annotated in two different handwriting styles, her father's precise, slightly right-leaning script, and another hand she didn't recognize but that wrote with the looping, pressured strokes of someone thinking at speed. The annotations were collegial, even affectionate in the way that two people working closely together develop a shorthand that outsiders can't fully read. There were small jokes in the margins. There were corrections made and agreed to and built upon. These were not the documents of a hostile negotiation or an adversarial relationship. These were the documents of people who trusted each other. Then the record simply stopped. The last document bearing both names was dated October 2003. After that, Richard Carter's name disappeared from the Hart Dynamics archive entirely, with no explanation that she could find. No termination agreement, no dispute resolution record, no letter of disengagement. He was there, and then he was not, in the institutional record, as completely as if he had been removed by someone who knew which files to touch. She found the box at the back of the archive, behind a row of annual reports from the mid-2000s. Sitting on a low shelf with her father's initials written on the side in his own hand. It was a standard archival box. Beige cardboard with a lift-off lid, and it was sealed with two strips of tape that had yellowed and partially released with age. She did not open it there. She carried it upstairs to her office, set it on her desk, and sat with it for a moment in the late morning light, with the lake visible through the window behind her, and thought about the fact that her father had set this aside and put it somewhere that was in the company's keeping but not quite in the company's record. He had not thrown it away. He had not made it easy to find. He had done something that felt, increasingly, like leaving a message for someone who would know how to look for it. She opened it. The letters inside were arranged chronologically, the earliest at the back and the most recent at the front, as if her father had been reading them regularly and replacing them in order. There were 43 letters in total, spanning from 1996 to 2015, the last one dated 11 months before William Hart's death. They were handwritten on both sides, in the two sets of handwriting she had already come to recognize. And they were not formal correspondence. They were the record of a friendship conducted over nearly 2 decades through the medium that both men seemed to have preferred to the telephone. Ink on paper, sent through the mail, with the particular deliberateness of people who wanted their words to mean exactly what they said. She read them all. It took most of the day. What she learned dismantled, slowly and completely, the version of the story she had assembled from the archive's silences. Richard Carter had not been removed from the partnership by her father. He had withdrawn himself, in 2003, because of a financial collapse that he had not told her father about until it was nearly complete, a series of bad investments and a contract dispute that had left his small firm structurally insolvent. He had, in his own words in the letter that explained it, been too ashamed to ask for help from someone he considered a partner and a friend, and so he had instead disappeared. Which was the kind of mistake that people made when shame was louder than reason. Her father had not understood. The letter from William Hart, written in response 3 pages long, the handwriting uncharacteristically pressured and urgent, made clear that he had been devastated by the disappearance and had spent months trying to understand what had gone wrong. They had found each other again 2 years later, through a mutual contact who had apparently decided that the silence between them had gone on long enough. The letters that followed this reconnection were the warmest in the box. Her father wrote about Richard in the language of someone restored to something he had not realized he was missing, with relief, with gratitude, with the particular joy of a relationship picked back up and found to be undamaged at its core. Richard wrote about her father with a frank admiration that was not sycophancy but simple, honest regard. And then, woven through the letters of the following decade, in increments so careful and oblique that she almost missed them, her father helping. Not with the large, visible generosity of someone performing benevolence, but with the quiet, specific help of someone who understood exactly what was needed and moved to provide it before it was asked for. A connection made to a firm that needed Richard's consulting expertise. A contract steered toward a company Richard was advising. An anonymous contribution to a scholarship fund for engineering students that, she now realized, had probably been created specifically to allow tuition payments to flow to a particular family without the appearance of charity. Her father had not wanted Richard to feel indebted. He had understood that Richard's dignity was bound up in his independence, and so he had protected both. One letter in particular from William, dated 2009, during the period when Ethan had been finishing his graduate degree and Richard's health was beginning to decline, stayed with her after she had set it aside. Her father had written about Ethan directly, calling him your son, who is so clearly yours in every way that matters, and expressing the hope that Ethan would find his own path to the work that Richard had poured his life into. There was a line that she read 3 times. I have always believed that what we started together will find its way to completion through the people who come after us, if we are wise enough to give it the right foundation and the right room to grow. She sat for a long time with that letter in her hands. Then she called Ethan Carter and asked if she could come back. She brought the box with her. She did not preface any of it or explain what she had found before she arrived, because she did not want to give him the edited version. She wanted to give him the thing itself, the same discovery she had made in real time. She set the box on the table between them and took out the letters in their order. And she watched his face as she explained what the archive contained. He was very still, in the way she had come to understand, was not distance but concentration, the expression of someone giving something their full and honest attention. When she showed him the patent co-filings, his expression changed in a way that was different from anything she had seen from him before. He took the documents carefully, holding them with both hands, and she could see him reading the names at the top: Richard Carter, William Hart, and recalibrating something internal, some understanding he had held for a long time that was being gently corrected. He had known, in a general way, that his father had once had business partners before the financial collapse that ended his formal career. He had not known that one of those partners was William Hart. He had not known, specifically and certainly, that the man whose daughter had been trying to buy his life's work for 14 months was the same man whose name appeared beside his father's on the foundational patents. He never mentioned your father by name, Ethan said slowly. Not to me. He talked about a partnership that ended badly. Ended because he was foolish, he always said. Because he let shame do the thinking. But he didn't give me a name. My father didn't mention yours to me either, Victoria said. I don't think they were protecting secrets. I think they were protecting each other. They read the letters together, sitting at the table in his office, with the photograph of Richard Carter on the wall above them. Ethan read with the focused silence of someone encountering a person they thought they knew and discovering new rooms. His father and her father, writing back and forth across 20 years, maintaining a friendship that neither had spoken about publicly, because the friendship belonged to them and not to anyone else's understanding of their careers or their choices. The warmth in the letters was unmistakable. The mutual respect was structural, present in every sentence, in the way they pushed back on each other's ideas with the directness of people who knew the other was strong enough to take it. When they reached the later letters, the ones from the years when Richard's health was declining and her father's anonymous support had been flowing steadily toward the Carter family, Ethan set the pages down and looked at his hands for a moment. He had grown up with a father who worked multiple consulting contracts simultaneously to keep them financially stable, who had turned down university positions to stay close to the work he believed in, who had, Ethan now understood, been the recipient of precisely timed help from a source he had never identified. He had attributed it to luck, to his father's reputation, to the general tendency of good work to eventually find its audience. He had not attributed it to a friend who had been watching out for them from a careful distance for over a decade. He would have hated it, Ethan said, and there was a complicated affection in his voice. Knowing someone was helping, he would have needed to argue with it. I think that's why mine did it the way he did, Victoria said. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people doing the same recalibration, adjusting the pictures they had carried of their fathers to include these new rooms, these hidden chambers of loyalty and care. She looked at the photograph on the wall, Richard Carter with his reading glasses pushed up, laughing at something just out of frame, and she thought about the fact that her father had known this man and loved this man and spent decades quietly honoring a friendship that had survived collapse and distance and the ordinary entropy of busy lives. She felt the specific grief that comes not from loss but from discovering. Too late. Something that you would have been grateful for in time. The board did not take it well. She had expected that. The acquisition of Horizon had been in the Heart Dynamics strategic plan for 8 months. And the $50 million offer was positioned as the logical conclusion of a carefully constructed investment thesis. The board members were not unreasonable people, but they were people whose job it was to maximize shareholder value, and the announcement that the CEO had unilaterally decided to withdraw a $50 million offer without board approval was the kind of thing that generated emergency calls at 7 in the morning, and expressions of concern that were actually expressions of something considerably sharper. The most pointed challenge came from Marcus Webb, who had been on the Heart Dynamics board for 11 years, and who had the ability to frame bad news as good judgment with a smoothness that Victoria had always admired in the abstract and found, at this particular moment, deeply irritating. He did not say that she was being irrational. He said that she was allowing personal considerations to influence fiduciary responsibilities, which was the same thing said in the language of governance rather than feeling. He laid out the projected returns. He quoted the analyst reports. He reminded her, with practiced gentleness, that William Hart had built this company on the principle of decisive and unsentimental acquisition. She let him finish. Then she said, "My father built this company on the principle that the best deals were the ones where both sides ended up with something they couldn't have achieved alone. That's not sentiment, that's strategy, and the deal I'm proposing still honors it." What she was proposing was not acquisition. It was partnership, genuine, structural partnership. With equity shared in proportion to contribution, governance rights distributed across both parties, and a foundational agreement that Horizon's public interest mandate would be protected in the corporate charter, not just in good intentions. It was, financially, a less immediately profitable structure than an outright purchase. It was also, she believed, a more durable one, because it was built on a foundation that wouldn't corrode the moment the first difficult decision arose about whether to serve a profit margin or a purpose. The board voted against it, 5-3. She used her executive authority to proceed anyway, which was technically within her rights as CEO, and technically the kind of move that caused boards to begin conversations about leadership transitions. She knew this. She proceeded. Ethan had not agreed immediately. That was not his way. And she had not expected it to be. He had taken several days not to perform deliberation, but to actually deliberate, sitting with the offer and testing it against everything he knew about the gap between what people said and what they did, and about whether the daughter of William Hart was capable of meaning what she appeared to mean. He walked with Lily one evening through the neighborhood where he had grown up, past the house where Richard had first covered a whiteboard with the equations that had become the skeleton of Horizon, and he explained to her, as accurately as he could, what was happening. Lily, who was 9 and exceptionally clear-eyed, listened to the whole story and then said, "So the question is whether you trust her." He had said yes, that was the question. She had thought about it and said, "You tear things up when you don't trust them. You sign things when you do." He had not pointed out that this was not precisely how contracts worked. He had instead understood that she was right. He called Victoria the next morning and said yes. They signed a partnership agreement in Ethan's office, with the photograph of Richard Carter on the wall and a copy of one of the letters, the one from 2009, the one where her father had written about giving things the right foundation and the right room to grow framed on the desk between them. It was not a ceremonial moment in the way that large business signings tended to be. There were no photographers, no champagne, no curated press statements. It was just the two of them, and the work, and the quiet understanding that they were honoring something that had been waiting a long time to be honored. The development phase took 18 months. It was not smooth. Genuine partnerships rarely were, because genuine partnerships required two parties to keep choosing collaboration over the easier paths of capitulation or control, and both Victoria and Ethan were people with strong convictions who had spent their careers being right, which was a foundation that required daily maintenance to keep from becoming a wall. There were arguments about timeline. There were arguments about scope. There were 3 extended standoffs about the governance structure that resolved only because both of them were willing to sit with the discomfort of disagreement long enough to find the position that was actually right rather than just the one that won. These were, Victoria found, some of the most honest working conversations she had ever had. Ethan had a way of naming the actual issue underneath the stated one that was occasionally infuriating and consistently useful. Lily came to the office sometimes on Saturdays, when Ethan worked and school was out, and she and Victoria developed an independent rapport that neither of them had precisely engineered. Lily was curious about everything and asked questions without social anxiety, the specific freedom of a child who had been raised by someone who answered questions honestly. She asked Victoria once, while sitting in a chair in the corner of Ethan's lab eating a sandwich, how she had known that buying Horizon would be wrong. Victoria had thought about it and said, "I didn't know. I only knew after I understood why your grandfather built it." Lily had considered this and said, "So you needed the story to understand the thing?" Victoria had said yes. Lily had nodded and gone back to her sandwich with the air of someone who found this perfectly sensible. It was in the final weeks of preparation for Horizon's public launch that Victoria found the last letter. She had been going through the box one more time, not searching for anything specific, but moving through the documents. In the way you moved through a place you were preparing to leave slowly, with attention, wanting to hold the whole of it in your mind before you moved on. The letter was in an envelope she had initially set aside because it had been sealed, unlike the others, with wax, a small pressed seal in the shape of a compass rose, which she recognized as the signet ring her father had worn every day of his life. The envelope was addressed in his hand, not to Richard Carter, but simply to V, just the single letter, written in the hand she had known all her life. She understood, holding it, that he had put it there for her, that the whole archive, the sealed box, the position behind the annual reports, the initials on the side had been arranged so that it could be found if someone looked with the right combination of access and reason. He had not left it with the lawyers. He had not attached it to the will. He had placed it in the company's keeping, where it would survive, in the one place where his daughter would eventually have both the authority and the occasion to look. She opened it at her desk, alone, in the early morning before anyone else had arrived. The letter was 2 pages long. He had written it, the date indicated, 8 months before his death, when he was still well enough to write clearly, but had apparently concluded that there were things he wanted to say, that conversation didn't allow for things that required the permanence of paper, the inability to interrupt or deflect or change the subject. He wrote about the company and what it had cost him and what it had given him, and he wrote about her with a precision of love that made her breath go short. And then, near the end of the 2nd page, he wrote about Richard Carter and the Carter family in terms that finally made fully clear what she had been assembling from fragments. "If you ever find yourself sitting across from Richard's son," her father had written, "I want you to know that whatever success we built here has a piece of them in it." Not in the legal sense, Richard would never allow that, but in the truest sense. He was the best kind of partner, which is the kind who makes you braver than you would be alone. I hid my help because he needed me to, and because pride is a reasonable thing to protect in a friend. But the hiding was never the truth. The truth was that everything I built believing that it mattered to him too. If you meet his son, treat him as I would have. And remember that the most important thing I ever learned in business is the thing that has nothing to do with business. That the agreements between people who genuinely trust each other are the only ones that last. Victoria Hart sat at her father's desk because that was what it was, finally, still, even after 6 years, and she cried in the particular way of someone who is not sad but overwhelmed. who is receiving something that is too large to take in all at once, and must instead be felt in pieces. She cried for the father she had known, and for the father she was now discovering, for the rooms in him she had not known existed, and for the joy and the grief of finding them this way, through paper, in a climate-controlled archive, long after she could thank him. She cried because he had been right about the agreements that lasted, and because she called Ethan and asked him to come in before the day's work started. When he arrived, she gave him the letter without preface, and she watched him read it, and she watched his face move through the same territory. Hers had the recognition, the recalibration, the specific and complex emotion of a child learning something about their parent that expands rather than diminishes them. When he finished, he held the letter for a moment and did not say anything. Then he looked up at her, and she could see that he was thinking about his father not with grief, which had had 4 years to become something quieter, but with a fullness that was not quite joy and not quite sorrow but contained both, the way things do when they have been waiting a long time to be understood. They drove together to the lab where the final Horizon build was being tested, and they hung the 2 photographs side by side on the wall facing the main workspace. Richard Carter laughing at something out of frame, and William Hart in a photograph she had brought from home, taken at a company retreat in the late 90s, standing with his hands in his pockets and squinting slightly into the sun with the expression of someone who is exactly where they want to be. 2 men who had built something together and never let the building stop, even when they were separated by circumstance and pride and the ordinary difficulty of living. 2 men who had kept a promise to each other across decades and distance and death, and who had left, as their joint inheritance, not money and not property, but the shape of something worth finishing. Horizon launched on a Thursday morning in April, without a press event, and without a keynote address, and without any of the theatrical machinery that accompanied the announcements of lesser things. The platform went live in 7 cities simultaneously, the first municipal implementations, built to specification with the public interest mandate, written into the code at the architectural level, designed from the ground up, to serve the communities that needed resilience most, and had historically received it last. The coverage was substantial, because the technology was genuinely significant, but neither Victoria nor Ethan was particularly present in the coverage. They were in the lab when it went live, watching the monitoring systems and drinking bad coffee, and occasionally looking at the 2 photographs on the wall, with the quiet attentiveness of people who are aware of being witnessed by something they can't fully explain. The partnership agreement between Hart Dynamics and Carter Engineering was, by any objective measurement, a less profitable arrangement for Hart Dynamics than an outright acquisition would have been. Victoria knew this. Her board had told her this, repeatedly and in detail. She had understood it every time, and remained unmoved, because she had come to understand something that the profit models couldn't fully capture, that the value of what they had built together was not reducible to its market potential, because its market potential was downstream of its integrity, and its integrity depended on it being exactly what it was, a joint venture between 2 parties who each had something the other needed, and who had chosen to build something together rather than to absorb or be absorbed. There were things she thought about, in the months that followed, when the work was in its steady rhythms, and there was room for reflection. She thought about the way her father had described his friend as someone who made him braver than he would be alone, and she thought about whether that was a definition of partnership or of friendship or of something that existed in the space between those 2 words, where the most important relationships lived. She thought about Ethan's daughter telling her that you signed things when you trusted them, and about the fact that the most important truth she had learned from a 9-year-old in a research lab was more useful than anything she had been taught in business school. She thought about Richard Carter at a whiteboard in the 1980s, writing equations for a problem that hadn't fully materialized yet, trusting that someone would eventually be ready for the solution. What a father left, she had come to understand, was not always what was visible. The visible things, the company, the assets, the career, the name were real and meaningful, but they were the surfaces of something deeper. What lasted, what shaped the people who came after, was the quality of the choices made when no one was watching, the values acted on when it would have been easier not to, the friendships maintained across difficulty, with a fidelity that required no audience because it needed none. Her father had spent 2 decades quietly ensuring that his oldest friend's family had what they needed. And he had done it invisibly, because his oldest friend's dignity mattered more to him than his own credit. That was not sentiment, that was character. And character, unlike contracts, did not expire. Horizon's second year brought the first major stress test, a grid failure, in one of the pilot cities during a severe winter storm that would, under the old system architecture, have left portions of the city without power for 3 to 4 days. Under Horizon's distributed model, the network rerouted and redistributed within 47 minutes. The monitoring data was extraordinary. The engineering team celebrated with the controlled excitement of people who have believed in something for a long time and are watching it prove itself at exactly the scale it was designed for. Ethan watched the data come in with his hands around a coffee cup, not saying much, and Victoria watched him and thought about Richard Carter, who had first understood this problem in the 1980s and had spent the rest of his life working toward its solution. He had not seen the solution finished, but he had given it everything he had. And then he had given it to his son. And his son had given it the same devotion. And now here it was, working, in the world, doing exactly what it was designed to do. He would have liked this, Ethan said, still looking at the data. Both of them would have, Victoria said. The room was quiet in the particular way that rooms are quiet when something important has just been understood by everyone in them. On the wall above the monitors, the 2 photographs looked out at the work, the old engineer with his reading glasses pushed up, laughing at something off camera, the businessman with his hands in his pockets, squinting into the sun. 2 men who had built a friendship and then built something together and then trusted the people who came after them to understand why it mattered. The room hummed with the technical processes of a system that was doing its job. Outside, in 7 cities, the infrastructure held. There was a morning, some months later, when Victoria arrived at the lab before Ethan and stood for a while in the quiet looking at her father's photograph. She was not sad. She realized, something that she did not have an immediate word for, the feeling of understanding a person after the fact, of receiving the full shape of someone you had thought you knew, of finding that the shape was larger and more generous than you had understood it to be. She had spent 6 years running a company that bore her father's name, and had believed, in the general way that busy people believe things they haven't examined closely, that she knew what he had stood for, and what he had valued, and what he had wanted to leave behind. She had been right about all of it, and she had missed the most important part, which was that the most important part had been hidden not from her, but for her, held in a box, in an archive, waiting for the moment when she was ready to understand what it meant. He had been trying to teach her something, she thought, through the patient medium of a hidden archive and 43 letters between 2 old friends. He had been trying to teach her that the agreements between people who genuinely trust each other were the only ones that lasted, and that trust was not a transaction and not a strategy and not a risk to be managed, but a choice, made repeatedly, in the direction of another person's dignity and well-being, without requiring acknowledgement or return. He had practiced that all his life. He had practiced it in the archived letters, and in the quiet redirected contracts, and in the anonymous scholarship fund, and in the careful invisibility of his generosity. And he had left it for her to find, because he had known with the particular confidence of a parent who understands their child that she would know what to do with it when she did. She thought about what Ethan had said in the boardroom, the day he tore the contract, that what she wanted to buy didn't belong to him. She understood now what he had meant, and it was not what she had thought it meant then. He had not been saying that Horizon was unsaleable. He had been saying that it belonged to something larger than ownership, to the 2 men on the wall, to the decades of work and sacrifice and friendship, to the communities who would eventually depend on it. He had been saying, in the language of a man who had internalized his father's values completely, that some things were only worth what they cost you to protect. Sometimes, her father had written, in a letter to Richard dated 2011, "The bravest thing you can do in business is refuse to reduce something to its market value. Everything real resists that reduction. Hold on to the things that resist it." Horizon launched its 3rd city cohort in the fall, and its 4th in the spring that followed. and the waiting list for municipal implementation grew longer each quarter as the performance data accumulated into something incontrovertible. The technology worked. The governance model held. The public interest mandate was not a constraint on the business. It was, as Ethan had always believed, and Victoria had come to understand, the source of the trust that made everything else possible. You could not build durable infrastructure on a foundation of cynicism. You needed to mean it. On the anniversary of the contract, signing the real one, the partnership agreement, not the one that had been torn, they put a small framed print in the lab between the two photographs. It was the first page of one of the letters from the box, the one where William Hart had written about the kind of foundation you gave things if you wanted them to outlast you. No one who visited the lab and saw it would have known what it was or why it was there. But the two people who had put it there knew, and that, as it had always been with the most important agreements, was entirely sufficient. The most valuable thing a father could leave behind was not wealth. It was not a company, not a name, not a portfolio of assets carefully arranged to minimize estate taxes and maximize intergenerational transfer. What lasted, what shaped the people who came after, and the choices they made, and the things they built was something quieter and more durable than any of that. It was the demonstration, lived out across decades and difficulty, that certain values were worth protecting even when protection was costly, that some agreements were sacred not because they were legally binding but because they were made between people of genuine honor, and genuine honor did not need a contract to hold. Victoria Hart had started the year trying to buy something. She had ended it understanding that the most important things were not for sale, and that this was not a limitation, but a mercy, because it meant they could not be lost, only forgotten, and they could always be found again if you were willing to look. She had found her father in a box of letters in a basement archive. She had found that his greatest gift to her was not the company, but the quality of the person he had quietly and persistently been when no one was looking. She had found, in the process, a partnership built on the only foundation that lasted, and in that lab, under the photographs of two men who had kept faith with each other across everything that life had required of them, the work continued, as it was always meant to, as they had always hoped it would, as the best things do when they are given the right foundation and the right room to grow.